The SEC is a mess, and we love it. Hey, welcome into the Voice of College Football, best discussion, debate, and analysis. Yes, the SEC scenarios are abundant. There is no way at this juncture in the season to run through all of the SEC scenarios, but we're going to lay out a groundwork in which we can track this logjam of a mess. 9 teams in the SEC have either 1 or 2 losses. Please like the video and subscribe right here at the Voice of College Football. Let's run it down. The SEC standings as we enter the second week of November look like this. Georgia and Texas A&M on top at 5-1, Tennessee at 4-1, Texas and LSU at 3-1. We've got a number of teams with 2 losses, including Vanderbilt, Ole Miss, and Bama with 3 wins, and Mizzou at 2-2. Now let's look at the head-to-head matchups because, of course, that's the first tiebreaker. So these are the most important games that have been played and won by these teams already. Georgia beat Texas. Texas A&M's got 2 wins against this collection of teams, LSU and Mizzou. Tennessee beat Bama. Texas has a win against Vandy. LSU beat Ole Miss. Vandy beat Bama. Ole Miss has defeated none of these teams. Bama has a win against Georgia and also Mizzou, and Mizzou's got a win in overtime against Vanderbilt. When we look at the next tiebreaker, it basically doesn't come into play at this point because there is no possible way, because the scenarios are too numerous among 9 teams, to go through all the possible common opponents scenarios because we don't know necessarily who's going to tie for either first or second place in the SEC that we would have to run the common opponent scenario. So that's a component that we will address later in November. Next tiebreaker, highest seeded win. Even though I don't agree with this tiebreaker being so high on the list, it is in fact the next tiebreaker. Who you defeated and the best win in the conference among the collection of teams that are in a tiebreaker. So right now, that would be Bama because they beat Georgia. Also, LSU's got a nice win against Ole Miss. Texas beat Vanderbilt. Tennessee beat Bama. And Mizzou beat Vandy. But as it stands right now, Bama's got the only win against a team with only 1 loss in the SEC. And, of course, that's Georgia. If we're dealing with a collection of teams, cumulative win percentage could be a factor. And there are only 2 teams among this collection which have faced a above 500 cumulative win percentage by its opponents, and that's LSU at 23-20, and Bama with the best winning percentage right now at 22-19. Everybody else has played a below 500 schedule. You see, again, that it's so close that we can't make a call right now because there's going to be more games, of course, added to these wins and losses. But right now, Georgia's played a pretty unfavorable schedule at 17-25. Tennessee's win percentage is even worse at 15-23, and Ole Miss pretty bad at 18-26. So they would be in unfavorable positions as it stands right now with just 2 or 3 games left in conference play. You would think with this many teams, 9, a collection of 9 teams out of 16 in the SEC, that a ton of them would be playing over the last 4 weekends of the season. But that's not the case. Just 2 games this weekend, LSU, Alabama, Ole Miss, and Georgia. Then over the last 3 Saturdays of college football, there's only 4 more games between all these 9 teams. That's incredible. Tennessee, Georgia, Vandy, LSU, Texas A&M, and Texas. And then Tennessee also plays Vandy. So we looked at the standings, and the SEC standings tell us that Texas A&M and Georgia are in prime position both at 5-1. They played the most games. They've only lost 1. Tennessee's right there at 4-1. Texas and LSU, only 1 loss, but they got more work to do, having played 2 less games than Texas A&M and Georgia. Vandy, Ole Miss, Bama, and Mizzou very much in play, but they need some help. Now let's look at the remaining schedules and see who has an easier road to Atlanta. So Georgia's got this game Saturday afternoon in Oxford as a 2.5-point favorite against Ole Miss. Then the Bulldogs only have 1 more SEC game. Their final 2 games are out of conference, so they've just got the date against Tennessee, which of course is going to be huge as long as Georgia can get past Ole Miss. And even if they don't, that still makes the Tennessee game even more crucial for Georgia, but it's a difficult 2 games for the Bulldogs to close out at 7-1. Texas A&M also at 5-1. They've got the week off, and then they take on New Mexico State. They only have 2 more SEC games. That's at Auburn, where they will be a fairly significant favorite, you would think, and then also the game against Texas. They'll be an underdog against the Longhorns, but they've got that game at home in College Station. On to 4-1 Tennessee. They've got a light task at home this weekend against Mississippi State, who's winless in the SEC. Then they've got the Titanic matchup on the road at Georgia. Then the final weekend of the season, typically a layup, but this season, of course, Vandy, a lot to handle here. So Tennessee's got to go on the road in Nashville against Vandy the final weekend of the season. On to Texas, 3-1 in the conference, meaning they've only played half of their conference games, so they have a lot of work to do. It starts with Florida in Austin this Saturday. The Gators playing better than many expected. At Arkansas, the Razorbacks got completely annihilated last weekend by Ole Miss, but otherwise have played tough against good teams like Tennessee. Texas has a date against Kentucky. Then they go on the road against Texas A&M, and there will probably be all sorts of implications on that game when those 2 old rivals get back together the final weekend of the season. What about LSU? They, like Texas, have only played 4 conference games, so still 4 to go. So even though we're into November, there's a lot to be decided here when you consider only half of the conference games have been played by the likes of LSU and Texas. So the Tigers get Alabama at home. Of course, that's going to be a huge game, and the losers knocked out of the playoffs most likely. LSU goes to Florida. They've got Vandy at home. They've got Oklahoma, that also in Death Valley. So a fairly light schedule once LSU would get by Alabama this Saturday. Speaking of Vandy, what about us talking about the Commodores as SEC championship contenders? Look at this. 3-2 right now, hanging on by a thread. Got South Carolina, not an easy task in Nashville this weekend. At LSU and Tennessee, Vandy's got a rough road. This is the most difficult schedule we've seen coming down the stretch of anyone we've looked at thus far, certainly because all 3 teams are extremely capable on Vandy's schedule, and actually they will probably be an underdog. They will be an underdog in all these games. But like that's new to the doors. They beat Virginia Tech as a 13-point dog. They beat Alabama as a 25-point underdog. They beat Kentucky as a 12-point dog. They've already done it 3 times as a double-digit dog. And even Texas they took to the wire 27-24 as an 18-point dog. So, of course, Vandy having a remarkable season. Hopefully they can close it out. Ole Miss is coming off 2 consecutive wins against Oklahoma and Arkansas. They've got the big date against Georgia, of course, coming up this weekend. Lose, and they're done from the SEC and the CFP. They go to Florida, and they got Mississippi State. They'll be a heavy favorite in both of those games. So get by Georgia, and Ole Miss comes back into play. They would be a 6-2 SEC team at that point. What about Bama at 3-2? Well, obviously the Tide's got to get past LSU in Death Valley coming up on Saturday night. They've got a date at Oklahoma. Auburn has been a pushover this year. So like LSU, if Bama gets by this game Saturday night, they look to be in great shape to get to 6-2. I don't think anybody, based on the way they've played thus far this season, gives Missouri any kind of chance in this. But they are 2-2, meaning they're right there with Vandy, Ole Miss, and Bama with just 2 losses, only 1 game back in the loss column. So we got to look at them. For Mizzou, it's a big game against Oklahoma this Saturday, at South Carolina, at Mississippi State, and Arkansas. So less than a daunting schedule, but South Carolina on the road is going to be difficult. And Missouri's actually a slight underdog against a 1-4 Oklahoma team this weekend. If Georgia and Texas run the table, they will meet in the SEC championship game because Texas will break that tie with Texas A&M head-to-head and knock out the Aggies. So we will have a clear-cut 7-1 Georgia versus 7-1 Texas in the SEC championship game. So this is how we project it right now. Look at the standings right there in the SEC. However, let's get an upset here and there. Most notably, Texas A&M winning the final game of the season against Texas. That would muddy the waters. So let's say we get exactly what we're predicting there, except Texas A&M pulls off the upset against the Longhorns. So what it really comes down to is where can Texas and Georgia lose? And of course, the Georgia game this weekend against Ole Miss and also their final SEC game against Tennessee are both possible losses. And for Texas, of course, it's the Texas A&M game. So the two most important games left to be played in the SEC, I believe, are Ole Miss and Georgia. And then, of course, that Texas A&M game, but also Georgia and Tennessee. So if you want chaos, root for the Rebels, root for the Vols to catch up with Texas and to Georgia. Your comments down below are always welcome here at the Voice of College Football. Please check out our SEC channel, and we've got channels for almost all these teams we're talking about in the SEC, so please check them out right here at the Voice of College Football, including live shows with Texas, Georgia, Florida, Ole Miss, Bama, and we're always adding. So keep it locked in right here at the Voice of College Football.